Before I start going over this list, let me just say I know these things tend to be very controversial. So let me start by saying I can only speak about martial arts for which I have a decent understanding. So this list is somewhat biased based on my own experiences. Second, I didn't include systems of martial arts that focus on forms, kata, or acrobatic kicks and throws. And I'm also not including defensive tactics or combatives programs that are exclusively for military and law enforcement. Even though some of these are the best at implementing firearms, the average person doesn't have access to them. And finally, this list isn't in any consecutive order from best to worst, because ultimately it's the firearm in this case that has the advantage. I know some people will scoff or say that boxing is not a martial art, or that it's not very well rounded, but it does offer some merit to people who carry firearms. The first thing I would point out is the way that some of the movements in boxing parallel those of shooting, and the most obvious is stance. Some shooting instructors even call certain shooting stances a modified boxing stance because of how it parallels an orthodox boxing stance with your offhand forward and your firing hand back. Another added benefit of boxing that a shooter gets is shoulder conditioning. The act of always keeping your hands up and repeatedly punching them out in front of you strengthens the shoulder muscles and can help with stabilization in pistol shooting. And finally, and maybe most importantly, is that boxers are very good at managing the distance between them and an opponent with their non-firing hand. It doesn't take a stretch of the imagination to see how this could be applied to create distance between you and an assailant, keeping your assailant at bay with your non-firing hand while allowing you to access your weapon with your dominant hand. So, Jujutsu can also be a very good martial art to supplement carrying a firearm. But I will say this one thing, and that is that I don't believe that most of the techniques and objectives that might serve one well in a Jujutsu competition will necessarily be what serves you well while carrying a sidearm. That being said, there are many aspects of Jujutsu that are very beneficial to someone who carries. And maybe the most important one isn't the ability to take the fight to the ground, but the ability to remain standing. As most people who practice a lot of takedowns in their sparring are usually going to have a much easier time defending against takedowns. And second is, of course, in the likelihood that a fight does end up on the ground, there are also a variety of Jujutsu techniques that would be quite useful for keeping control of your weapon while on the ground. Wrestling is probably one of the more underrated styles on this list, but wrestling actually has some very good merit for people who carry a firearm, especially in a scenario where you are trying to retain a sidearm that is holstered on your hip. Why I think wrestling is actually very good is because on a very rudimentary level, they have very good physical conditioning, body position, and a strong focus on dominance. They are very good at controlling their opponent's arms and upper body, and probably most important is they seem to be very good at keeping their hips out of reach of their opponent. And if your opponent can't reach your hips, when you're carrying a firearm holstered on your hips, they won't be able to reach your firearm. I will also note that of what I've seen when people with little or no training train in sidearm retention scenarios where one person plays the good guy and one person plays the bad guy, what happens oftentimes ends up looking like sloppy or untrained wrestling. So now I'm going to start talking about self-defense systems that are less sport-oriented and spend a bit more time addressing the presence of weapons. And one of the first ones that comes to mind when talking about weapons is Kali. Now, when I say Kali, I'm also talking about the greater Filipino and Malaysian martial arts that focus on training with bladed and impact weapons. So the benefits of this is not only does the shooter gain some empty hand skills, they also gain very good understanding of how to use impact weapons like flashlights, kubitons, and of course knives that can be carried in conjunction with a pistol. Kali also gives the practitioner a higher understanding and awareness of weapons in general, how people carry them, conceal them, and deploy them. And understanding some of these cues could absolutely be life-saving if you are confronted by an armed assailant. I don't think anyone would be surprised to see Krav Maga on this list. Rudimentary dirty fighting techniques such as groin kicks and eye pokes are a staple of Krav Maga. It also has some clinch work and some very basic ground survival. But there is also a heavy focus on the presence of weapons and weapon disarming, which has the added benefit of making you more aware of disarms and in turn makes you somewhat better at retaining your own weapon. I do feel it needs to be said though that while there are many competent Krav Maga instructors who know their way around a firearm, this is not something that can always be assumed. There are Krav Maga instructors who practice all sorts of weapon disarming techniques who really don't know what they're doing with a firearm. And I know it'll hurt some people's feelings when I say this, but if you don't have any certification or background in firearms, you don't have any business teaching other people how to disarm them. For martial arts that specifically address firearms, one thing you should consider is the background of your instructor. For example, are they prior military or law enforcement? Or do they have certification, for example, from the NRA? Now, for what I just said, the same thing can definitely be applied to this next system I'm going to speak about. Not all instructors are equal. There are instructors who spend a lot of time teaching dynamic and realistic techniques to military and law enforcement. And there are also instructors who spend most of their time teaching martial arts to children. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's something you should probably consider if you're looking for this kind of training. With that being said, the next style I'm talking about here is Hapkido, and more specifically combat Hapkido, which has many of the same techniques as traditional Hapkido, but without any of the traditional rigid forms or fancy high-flying kicks. Much like the last system, this system also has heavy focus on self-defense techniques and weapon disarming. In addition to that, the kind of grip training used in Hapkido not only helps for better grip stability when shooting, but has the added benefit of paralleling good trigger discipline. Hapkido also has balance disruption, joint lock techniques, and takedowns that are practiced from various grabs, including many from belt grab techniques, which take very little adjustment to be used for sidearm retention, assuming you carry your sidearm on your belt. So the last one I'm going to talk about here is spear, and I know people are going to say that spear is also not a martial art either, but ultimately what is or isn't a martial art probably depends on your definition of what a martial art is. From a technique-based perspective, they have a very simple gross motor skill response method of training that can be very useful for creating a frame or barrier between you and an assailant and managing the distance enough to keep control of your holstered weapon. It's a simple concept very easy for someone who is a non-martial artist to learn, or can be added to your toolkit if you are a martial artist. Spear also spends more time focusing on things like psychology, physiology, and fear, as well as things like pre-engagement cues than most of the other systems on this list. And it is also widely taught to military and law enforcement. So that's my top picks for systems that I think would be very beneficial for someone who carries a firearm. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Agree, disagree, like, dislike, subscribe, and if you have knowledge or experience in other systems that you believe would be equally beneficial, go ahead and mention them. As an added bonus to this video, I would like to share a final thought that might add some merit to traditional martial arts like karate. And that is, the more that I practice martial arts with a weapon, the more that I find my hand tracing back to my hip. This motion is not so different than what we see in traditional martial arts when they train to chamber their hands near their belt. This, of course, makes much less sense if you are fighting in an MMA match, but it begins to seem more practical when you are carrying weapons on your belt. And while I can't for certain say that this is the reason it's done in traditional martial arts, I can for certain say that most of the traditional martial arts practiced today are descended from military combatives and defensive tactics that were practiced in feudal warrior class societies hundreds of years ago, which is at very least interesting to think about.